In the fall of 1985, one of television's most legendary titles came back to life on CBS, with a new team, a new sound, and a stack of stories that nobody expected from primetime. Most people remember watching it. Very few knew what was really going on behind the camera. These are The Twilight Zone, 1985. 15 secrets hidden for decades. Secret 15, the endings that were changed, and the writers who walked away because of it.
You know, telling us we could have all that money. Make us think about it.
Why don't you push it and get it off your mind?
The 1985 Twilight Zone had a recurring problem that nobody on the production could quite solve. CBS executives kept rewriting the endings. Two of the most documented cases involve writers who felt so strongly about what was done to their conclusions that they removed their own names from the finished episodes. The first is Richard Matheson. He adapted his own short story, Button Button, for the revival. A tale about a married couple offered a mysterious choice. Press a button and receive a large sum of money, knowing that someone they have never met will die as a result. In Matheson's original story and his initial teleplay, the ending followed a strict moral logic that gave the piece its entire meaning. CBS executives insisted on a different conclusion. The changes gutted the moral architecture of the story. Matheson refused to have his name attached to what aired on March 7, 1986, and instead used his long-standing pseudonym, Logan Swanson, for the credit. The episode went out without his name. The ending CBS insisted upon replaced his intended conclusion entirely, and Matheson never publicly softened his position on what was done to it. The story was eventually adapted again, faithfully this time, as the 2009 film The Box, directed by Richard Kelly and starring Cameron Diaz and James Marsden. The second case involves Harlan Ellison and his episode Paladin of the Lost Hour, which aired on November 8, 1985. Ellison had adapted his own novelette about an old man named Gaspar carrying a pocket watch containing the last hour of time remaining in the universe, and a Vietnam veteran named Billy who becomes his companion. The original ending had a specific conclusion Ellison had written into both the novelette and the teleplay. Story editor Alan Brennert and associate producer James Crocker argued across multiple meetings that it needed to change. Ellison eventually agreed and changed the ending in both the teleplay and in the novelette itself when it was later collected in his book Angry Candy. The original conclusion he wrote never aired and exists only as an earlier draft. Secret 14, CBS had already turned down Francis Ford Coppola's pitch for this same revival.
Just the infinite emptiness. I'm just an old man, Billy, and I'm frightened because I want to spend my last hour with Minna.
Before the 1985 version of The Twilight Zone came to exist, Francis Ford Coppola wanted to make it. In the years following the original series' end in 1964, Rod Serling had sold the rights to The Twilight Zone back to CBS, which gave the network control over any future revival. Various people approached CBS about bringing the show back, including the original production team of Serling and producer Buck Houghton. CBS turned them all down, including Coppola. By the time Coppola pitched the revival, he had already directed The Godfather, 1972, The Godfather Part 2, 1974, and Apocalypse Now, 1979. He was not an unproven filmmaker asking for a chance. He was one of the most acclaimed directors in American cinema. CBS said no anyway. Their hesitation was rooted in a specific institutional memory. The Twilight Zone had never been the ratings blockbuster CBS wanted it to be during its original run, even though it had become one of the most beloved shows in television history. The network did not see any reason to believe a revival would perform differently. What ultimately changed the calculation was not creative enthusiasm, but business logic. CBS program chief Harvey Shepard pointed to the success of Steven Spielberg's films in the early 1980s, among them E.T. and Poltergeist, as evidence that audiences were receptive to fantasy and science fiction. As an in-house production, a new Twilight Zone would also be considerably more profitable than licensing from an outside company. The green light came in 1984 under CBS Vice President of Drama Development Carla Singer, driven by that combination of market timing and financial incentive. Secret 13, Rod Serling's Ghost, was written into the opening credits.
You walk into this room at your own risk, because it leads to the future. Not a future that will be, but one that might be. This is not a new world. It is simply an extension of what began in the old one.
Rod Serling died in June 1975 at the age of 50, a decade before the revival that bore his creation's name. He was not available to narrate the new series, and no one would have attempted to replace him directly. Charles Aidman, who had himself appeared in 2 episodes of the original series, took on the narration duties for the first 2 seasons on CBS, his voice familiar to television audiences from years of work, but carrying none of Serling's iconic weight. The producers found one way to acknowledge that absence without pretending to fill it. In the revival's opening title sequence, a brief and ghostly image of Rod Serling appears, a flicker of his face from the original series, there for just a moment before the new show's imagery takes over. It was a tribute rather than a substitution, a way of placing the new production in the lineage of the original without claiming to be its equal. Aidman narrated off-screen. Unlike Serling, who walked on camera and addressed the audience directly, neither Aidman nor his eventual replacement Robin Ward ever appeared on screen. That choice kept the original's silhouette present in a way that nothing else could. Secret 12. The Grateful Dead recorded the theme, with Mickey Hart in a hospital bed. When executive producer Philip DeGuerre needed music for the 1985 revival, he turned to jazz keyboardist Merle Saunders, who had been a longtime collaborator with Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. Saunders brought Garcia and the rest of the Dead into the project to write and record a new version of the theme, retaining elements of Marius Constant's original 1959 composition while bringing a distinctly different sonic texture. What most people never heard about was the circumstance under which some of that music was actually recorded. Mickey Hart, the Grateful Dead's drummer, underwent back surgery just as the sessions were beginning. Rather than step back, he had the recording equipment moved into his hospital room and recorded portions of the music from his bed, on Demerol prescribed for his recovery. Hart later recalled that the medication proved aesthetically stimulating. A full soundtrack album was eventually released, credited to the Grateful Dead and Merle Saunders. Secret 11. The show was supposed to air at 10 p.m. CBS moved it to 8 p.m. without warning.
Well, hi, Robert.
Oh, hey, Mr. Lowry. You know that new girl in accounting, Barbie?
Sure.
Well, I've been asking her out, and she finally says okay. She's gonna be here in 5 minutes, and I can't think of any place that'd take her for dinosaur.
One of the least discussed reasons why the 1985 Twilight Zone struggled in the ratings involves a decision made by CBS that the production team didn't find out about until it was too late to do anything. Executive producer Philip DeGuerre was told, during development, that the show would air in the 10 p.m. time slot. Late evening, an adult-oriented hour, the kind of window where darker and more challenging material could find its audience without alarming anyone. The earliest episodes were written specifically for that environment. DeGuerre and his team produced stories that pushed into territory that would have been entirely appropriate for a late-night adult drama. Then, CBS moved the show to 8 p.m., the family viewing hour, without consulting the producers or giving them enough advance notice to adjust what was already in the pipeline. The first 6 episodes of the series aired during a time slot that DeGuerre himself later said was completely wrong for their content. The fourth episode in particular included a segment called Night Crawlers, directed by William Friedkin and based on Robert R. McCammon's story, which Daguerre considered among the most violent and disturbing works ever broadcast on American television at that point. The show's ratings dropped from a 30 share to a 22 share between episodes 4 and 5, and that gap was never fully closed. The rating slide that contributed to the series' eventual cancellation began, at least in part, with an 8 p.m. time slot that no one on the production had agreed to. Secret 10. George R.R. Martin was a staff writer, and CBS executives kept breaking his scripts.
I'm sorry, I must have dialed the wrong number.
What number did you want?
Klondike 5, 6189.
This is Klondike 5, 6189. Who are you calling?
Nah, I must have dialed wrong.
Before George R.R. Martin was known around the world as the author of A Song of Ice and Fire and the creator of the world that became Game of Thrones, he was a staff writer on the 1985 Twilight Zone. He contributed several episodes to the series, and his experience working inside the CBS network machinery of the mid-1980s left him with distinct frustrations that he discussed publicly afterward. One of his specific complaints involved the network executives' determination that every Twilight Zone story had to follow a particular formula. Something extraordinary happens to an ordinary person. Martin's own storytelling instincts didn't always align with that structure, and when he wrote scripts that deviated from it, the executives pushed back by requiring him to insert ordinary person characters who served no real narrative function. He specifically identified the character of Tom in his episode The Last Defender of Camelot, based on a story by Roger Zelazny, as a character added purely to satisfy the network's formula requirement, and who contributed nothing to the story otherwise. The interference frustrated Martin enough that he spoke about it in detail long after the show was over, which is itself a measure of how seriously he took the work and how much the meddling bothered him. Secret 9. Bruce Willis played the premiere episode before moonlighting made him famous.
Some push for what they need. Some push for what they want. Some people, like Peter J. Novins, just push. If they do it hard enough and long enough, something might just push back. From the Twilight Zone.
The very first segment of the very first episode of the 1985 Twilight Zone was called Shatterday, directed by Wes Craven and based on a short story by Harlan Ellison. It starred Bruce Willis in the lead role, a man named Peter J. Novins, who accidentally dials his own phone number and discovers that a double of himself has taken over his apartment and is living the life he had abandoned. Willis played both versions of the character, the original and the better self that had separated from him and refused to give back what it had claimed. The episode premiered on September 27, 1985. Moonlighting had premiered earlier that year, in March, and Willis was still a working actor building his resume when he stepped in front of Wes Craven's camera for Shatterday. Craven pushed him toward a quieter, more inward performance than his comedic television persona suggested, and the result was striking enough to stand on its own. Secret 8. Wes Craven and William Friedkin were among the directors, and neither was typical TV.
Huh?
Timber hinge. Big torch to zoom this carload whistle. Use Metro Panther call blade. Hinge.
The 1985 Twilight Zone attracted filmmakers who were not typically found in network television. Wes Craven, who had already made A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, directed multiple episodes in the first season, including the series premiere Shatterday. William Friedkin, director of The French Connection, 1971, and The Exorcist, 1973, directed Night Crawlers. Neither man was a television regular by that point. Craven's horror credentials gave certain episodes of the first season a stylistic intensity that stood out from everything else on CBS on a Friday night. Friedkin's Night Crawlers, in which a Vietnam veteran's nightmares literally become real and begin killing people around him, was the episode that executives later blamed for the most dramatic single-week ratings drop the show experienced. The segment was visually aggressive and emotionally unrelenting in a way that went well beyond what the family viewing hour typically contained. The fact that Philip Daguerre had assembled a roster of directors that included Craven and Friedkin said something about the ambitions the production had brought to the project. Ambitions that the network's time slot decision immediately complicated. Secret 7. The show adapted stories by Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, and Stephen King.
And the key that unlocks the dome of the button unit fits into this slot in the side, like so. In this way, you can push the button.
The 1985 Twilight Zone did not rely solely on original scripts. A significant portion of the series drew on published fiction, and the names behind those source stories read like a syllabus of American genre literature. Ray Bradbury contributed source material. Arthur C. Clarke, the British author of 2001, A Space Odyssey, provided stories. Stephen King, who by 1985 was the most commercially successful horror writer in the world, had work adapted for the show. Harlan Ellison's stories launched the series itself. The revival also adapted work by Greg Bear and Robert R. McCammon, and the writing staff included Rockne S. O'Bannon, who would later create Farscape, and J. Michael Straczynski, who would go on to create Babylon 5. Both were, in 1985, early in careers that would prove substantial. The combination of established literary sources and new scripts by serious genre writers gave the show a textual quality that not many network anthology series could claim. Secret 6. Richard Matheson took his name off his own episode.
What you're looking at could be the end of a particularly terrifying nightmare. It isn't. It's the beginning.
Richard Matheson was one of the most important writers in the history of the original Twilight Zone. He had written 16 episodes of the Serling series, including Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, the story of the man who sees a gremlin on the wing of an airplane, which became one of the most famous episodes in the show's history. When the 1985 revival asked him to adapt his own short story, Button Button, he agreed. The story involves a couple who receive a mysterious box with a button on it. They are told that if they press the button, they will receive a large sum of money, and someone they do not know will die. Matheson wrote a teleplay that adhered to the moral logic of his original story. The network then required changes that altered that moral logic in ways Matheson found unacceptable. The specifics of what was changed are documented in accounts from the production, but Matheson's response was unambiguous. He asked that his name be removed from the episode. The segment aired without his credit. The story was later adapted again, much more faithfully, as the 2009 film The Box, directed by Richard Kelly. Secret 5. The show beat the competition for its first month. Then the ratings collapsed.
Mr. Trooper, you don't want me in your territory, believe me. Not with a body count I got in my head.
You're coming with me, mister. I'm placing you under arrest.
When The Twilight Zone premiered on Friday, September 27, 1985, it did something the network had not been counting on. It won its time slot. The show beat its competition in 4 of its first 5 weeks on the air. CBS, which had greenlit the revival with considerable skepticism and had managed to schedule it in a time slot inappropriate for its content, suddenly had a genuine early hit on its hands. The momentum did not hold. The 4th episode, the one containing William Friedkin's Night Crawlers, produced the drop in ratings that the production team traced to the time slot mismatch. Audiences who tuned in expecting a family-friendly Friday evening found something considerably more disturbing. The ratings fell and did not recover to the same level. By mid-season, the show was being beaten by sitcoms. Executive story consultant Alan Brennert later described the indignity of being outperformed in the ratings by Webster and Mr. Belvedere, 2 comedies that occupied a completely different creative universe. The show was renewed for a 2nd season anyway, partly because of the prestige the title carried, and partly because the production economics favored CBS, but the first-month promise was never quite recaptured. Secret 4, the third season was shot entirely in Toronto and used only Canadian actors.
Toronto, the capital of Ontario, is home to more than 1 million people.
When CBS ended its relationship with the original production team after 2 seasons, the network made a sweeping set of changes for the third season, which aired in first-run syndication beginning in September 1988, rather than on CBS itself. Production moved to Toronto, Canada, where costs were lower and the infrastructure for television production was well established. Every episode of the third season was filmed there. To comply with Canadian content regulations, every episode in the third season cast Canadian actors. The narrator changed as well. Robin Ward replaced Charles Aidman for this season. The result was a show that technically bore the same title and format, but had been fundamentally reconstituted in almost every visible way. The writing team was restructured around executive producer Mark Shelmerdine, who had previously worked on Claudius. Secret 3, the episode that was killed mid-production and never aired.
That's much stronger. So you're talking to Debbie, where do you think you're going? Young lady, where is my daughter wandering off to by herself?
It's all right, Mrs. Cunningham. We find that the children benefit most when they visit the zoo on their own.
The single most dramatic off-screen event in the entire run of the 1985 Twilight Zone is the story of an episode called Knackles. And it is, in its own way, as dark as anything the show managed to put on screen. Knackles was based on a 1964 short story by Donald E. Westlake, published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. The story imagined a malevolent counterpart to Santa Claus, a terrifying creature called Knackles, who punished bad children the way Santa rewarded good ones. Harlan Ellison adapted the story for the show's Christmas special and was set to direct it himself, which would have been his directorial debut on television. Ed Asner, one of the most respected character actors in American television history, was cast in the lead role. George R.R. Martin had initially been involved in the teleplay before moving on to a different episode. Ellison's version of the story reworked the central character into a bigoted welfare worker who invented Knackles to torment the minority children in his care, before the creature turned on him. In November 1985, CBS's West Coast Program Practices Division shut the production down mid-shoot. The censors found the racial themes too inflammatory for a primetime Christmas broadcast. The cost of the aborted production ran somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000. Ellison's response was characteristically public and furious. He described the network's objections in print and in interviews for years afterward, calling their suggestions vile and infamous. The episode never aired. It remains one of the most discussed unmade pieces of television from that era. A production stopped in its tracks and sealed away, with Ed Asner's performance and Ellison's directorial debut both disappearing with it. Secret 2, CBS replaced the entire production team between seasons 2 and 3.
You'll survive, won't you? We'll all be killed. But you'll survive.
The transition from Season 2 to Season 3 was not merely a change in format, it was a complete dismantling of the creative infrastructure that had built the show. CBS replaced Philip DeGuere's entire production team when it moved the series into syndication. The writers, the production staff, the approach, all of it changed. The network brought in a new group led by executive producer Mark Shelmerdine, and the show's creative identity shifted substantially. Staff writer Michael Cassett, who had been part of the original team, later reflected that the show had always been uneven, that some episodes were genuinely in the spirit of the original Twilight Zone, while others could have come from any anthology series on the air. The third season, made under entirely different circumstances on a different continent by a different team, produced its share of episodes that critics and fans regarded highly, but the continuity of vision that had carried the first 2 seasons was gone. The 1985 Twilight Zone ended its run in April 1989, 65 episodes across 3 seasons, its history marked throughout by network interference, a misplaced time slot, a Christmas episode destroyed in production, and a writing staff that included some of the most serious genre talent working in American fiction at the time. Secret 1. Rod Serling had tried to revive it himself before selling the rights and was turned down.
But like every one of the superstates that preceded it, it has one iron rule. Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace.
The fact that Rod Serling was not involved in the 1985 revival is well known. What is less often said is that he tried to be. After the original series ended in 1964, Serling and producer Buck Houghton approached CBS about bringing the show back. They were the people who had built it. They understood what it was and what it needed. CBS turned them down. Serling eventually made the decision to sell his share of the rights back to CBS, transferring control permanently. What he got was a stream of licensing revenue from the original series in syndication. What he gave up was any future say over the property. He died in June 1975, following open-heart surgery at the age of 50, 9 years before CBS greenlit the revival. He never wrote for a revived series, never narrated it, and never saw what became of the show he had built. The ghost image in the opening credits was the closest thing to his presence that any revival was ever able to offer. A flicker on the screen for a moment, and then gone. 3 seasons, 65 episodes, a Christmas special that was killed during production, 2 narrators, a complete change of production team mid-run, a time slot that nobody on the creative side had agreed to, and a roster of writers and directors that most prestige cable dramas today would envy. It launched a pre-famous Bruce Willis, lost Harlan Ellison in a blaze of fury, and then got the best episode he ever wrote for the show, and adapted stories by Ray Bradbury, Stephen King, and Arthur C. Clarke for an audience CBS kept moving to different rooms. The 1985 Twilight Zone never quite lived up to what it might have been, but it kept trying, and some of what it produced was worth every complicated thing it cost to make. If you found this one worth your time, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another look behind the screen at the stories that shaped what we watched.